Good evening. Welcome to a night of Read to Me Admin. Tonight, I'll actually be reading a tale that I wrote myself a couple years ago called The Maniac. It's a fairly short tale, probably won't take us very long. However, halfway through printing it out, my printer ran out of ink. So I will be reading the first half off screen, and the second half, there will be something physical in my hands. The story is extremely graphic, extremely violent, and very unpleasant. However, I wrote it during a very challenging time in my life with the career choice at that day. I hope you enjoy it. Please leave me some feedback. Please subscribe. Joe TV. This is the story of a short, terrible night. A story of dark, twisted intrigue. A story of gory, offensive terror. A story of a maniac. The rain was pouring as though it was a showerhead on full blast, and hot water had gone out. The kind of rain that drenched the skin and froze the bones. One man looked out the window, blurred by the reflection of himself. Lightning flashed in the distance, and for a brief second, the man saw the courtyard outside. A once tranquil garden with a modest fountain was now filled with a dozen bodies that he had slain. He had murdered them all mercilessly and without any discretion. His face was covered in blood and bits of flesh that tore from his face after a victim tried to scratch their way to escape. The victim had left one of his fingernails lodged in the man's face, but it had fallen out somewhere in the courtyard. He brandished a bloody and rusty pipe in one hand. The other was mangled with bits of glass, wires tied around it to keep the hand from falling apart. He was a very tall and burly man. He staggered at 320 pounds of filth, girth, and sick determination. Morris P. Schwartz. He turned away from the window and walked down the long, narrow hall that blinked with the threat of a power outage. There was a set of bloody footprints he had been following. He knew they'd lead him to the nurse that he had his eye on ever since he came to the asylum. There was something about her that intrigued him, something about her that made him want to strangle her to death while screwing her corpse through the night and into the morning. He imagined hanging her lifeless body on a crucifix and using her eyes as bait to lure in the crows. He wanted to be plunging his knife inside of her while hooking her thighs to a car battery. He smiled to himself before smacking the pipe across his own chest. He had to stay focused. He was getting far too aroused, and he knew it. He coughed a few times, growled at the pain, and continued to follow the bloody tracks. The nurse, Candace, otherwise known as Candy, Jennison, had joined this job after being in unemployment for 3 months and living off her boyfriend, lately turned fiancé. Today was her 4th day on the job. She had never met Morris before today, but had heard rumors of him from the senior nurses. They only referred to him as the man on floor 6. The nurses told her tales about past incidences where Morris had attacked people or tried to persuade others to do the same. They told her that he had a strange power over the other patients. Unlike most buildings, the Adder Estate labeled its buildings from highest to lowest. The first floor was actually the 3rd, and the 6th was the furthest underground. Only 4 clients stayed on floor 6. Morris and 3 others Candy had only heard of in passing. The others were less talked about, but still filed as extremely dangerous. Candy was currently hiding in the laundry chute, her feet pressed against one side, her back against the other. The door to the chute couldn't be locked, but it was the first place she thought of that wasn't an obvious hiding space. Her white scrub pants and shirts were soaked in blood that wasn't hers. She had a deep cut across her back where Morris had cut her earlier with a shard of glass. Her emerald green eyes were swollen from crying. Her short brown hair stuck to the sweat of her brow. She did her best to keep her breathing calm and quiet. She held the position well, her fit and toned body able to carry her body weight for quite some time. But it wouldn't be long until her energy did begin to wane. She was an average of 5'6" at 140 pounds, though most of it was muscle. She tried to map out the floors in her head. The lockers were only a few rooms away from the break room. Inside her locker was a cell phone, her car keys which had a keychain of pepper spray, and a few pictures of her fiancé taped to the locker door. She could hear the rolling thunder outside the asylum, The sound seemed to be taunting her of how close the outside world was. She had to think of a plan to leave this chute, sneak to the lockers, and use her cell phone to call for help. She had no idea how many people were dead, but as she ran to her current location, there seemed to be dozens. Staff and clients being butchered alike as some clients escaped the asylum, or others had joined Morris in his slaughter. The clients seemed to join or flee at random, except for a handful who were determined to stay, as if they had planned to join Morris all along, though Candy had absolutely no idea as to why. She shook the images of brutality from her mind and looked at the door in the dim light from the curved chute's drop. She slowly pushed on it, but stopped when a slight creak whispered, but seemed to scream and echo into the room on the other side. Candy took a deep breath, assuring herself that there was no way Morris would just happen to be in this one room, out of the hundreds in Adder Estate, and she gave the door a quick push. She quickly jumped out of the chute and landed with bended knee, anticipating an attack to her head, but no one was in the solid white room. She looked around the room for any sort of weapon, but only saw empty clothes carts and soiled laundry. 3 rooms to the right, she looked out the doorway quickly, both sides, and ducked back inside after seeing it was clear. She took 2 breaths, and quickly left the room to quietly jog down the hall. Morris licked the bloody footprint with as much tongue as he could press against the floor. He traced the second print with his mangled fingers as he tapped against the floor with his pipe. He breathed like an animal in heat as sweat dripped from his head and into the crimson of the tile. "Why can't you realize? This is for us," he whispered before standing and walking down the line of prints. He thought of Candy, the time he saw her giving a nurse a dosage of medication to give to a patient. He wasn't sure if she saw him. He was surrounded by guards at the time. It was at that moment, though, 4 days ago, that their destinies were sealed. He had dreamed about her for nights and into the days where he wasn't allowed to leave his room. He cut himself deeply with his jagged fingernails while he thought of her. Would she want to feel that? He asked himself. The true pleasure that pain brings. He breathed out deeply, the words quietly, as he slowly walked down the hall. Candy noted the camera in the high corner of the hall. If anyone was in the office, they would have been gone by now. Chances are they were dead, but each person in the office had a radio on their hip at all times. She needed to find one if she couldn't find her phone. How could this have happened? She slowly thought as she saw the break room was only 2 doors away. She looked over her shoulder to make sure no one was sneaking up behind her, as the light over her head flickered on and off. Each second it was out, the asylum became as black as the heart of a cave. She soon reached the break room door and slowly pushed it open. There was a rustling that immediately caught her attention. Her ears pricked as her heart raced. Across the room she saw a man in the blue jumpsuit of a patient. There was scribbling on a plastic table with a pencil that was missing its lead. Candy stayed quiet. This client should be dead or trying to escape, and if they're not, then they must be helping Morris. But when the man looked up with deeply glazed over eyes, Candy recognized them, not as a patient, but as a staff member. "Mr. Masato," Candy asked the man, who simply smiled a smile that was missing several new broken teeth. A smile of raw and blood. "Mr. Masato, what happened? Why are you in those clothes?" Candy asked, not sure why that was her first question of choice. As she spoke, she slowly made her way towards her locker, slowly enough not to startle the man at the table, who followed her like a slow animal studying a new life form. "Can you see?" the man asked slowly, his mouth barely moving to fit the words. Candy's hand barely touched the edge of her locker, and as she slowly began to pull it open, Masato's head turned sideways, his smile still wide and open. "Can you see?" he repeated, holding up the pencil with the broken end at her. "I can see that we need to go," Candy whispered, not taking her eyes off him, and blindly feeling around inside her locker but not feeling anything. She briefly looked over to see her locker was empty, and back at Masato, who slowly began to stand. What happened to my things?" Candy ordered, as the man gripped the broken pencil tightly. "Morris has promised us a promised land, with a great and ancient guardian." "What the fuck are you talking about?" Candy ordered. "A town. A small town. Not far from here," Masato promised. "Where are my things? What happened to my locker? "Where's my stuff?" she ordered, louder than she meant. "Your things are inside," he softly replied, pointing to his stomach. And without warning, he jammed the pencil's end deeply into his own eye socket. He didn't scream, as blood erupted around the wound and through the cracks of his fingers. He began murmuring a laugh before he fell to his knees. Candy stood in shock as the man fell to his chest, his hand never losing grip of the lodged pencil as his body trembled from sporadic chuckles. Candy stood for several moments, as the blood pooled around the man's head. Her breathing was growing frantic. She felt dizzy, on the brink of passing out, when the break room door opened. It was then Morris charged in like a raging bull. He growled madly and swung his pipe over his head. Candy had just a second to duck as the pipe went over her and against the metal lockers. The loud clang was deafening as Morris groped at her hair with his barely usable hand. She fell to her rear, dodging the grab, and kicked backwards with her feet as Morris prepared another swing with his pipe. She scrambled over the top of the table and tripped over a line of folded chairs as the maniac slammed wildly against the plastic table, busting a hole clean through with his pipe. As Candy quickly regained her footing and ran for the door. She was barely missed by a folded chair that slammed against the wall as Morris picked up a second one to throw. She more or less fell out of the break room door and ran down the hall, the traction of her nurse shoes threatening to make her slip with every squeak that they yelped. Morris bashed through the door and saw his prey was in flight. Without a moment's pause, he gave chase. His footsteps were booming through his own echoes as he brought the pipe over his head and threw it like a tomahawk. With a sickening clank, it went against her back, sending her off her feet and sliding across the floor, with the pipe rolling over her and tumbling only a few feet away. She turned over and tried to breathe. The wind was knocked out of her completely, as Morris was on top of her in only seconds. She gasped for air, unable to fight, as Morris growled with a madman's drool. The maniac pressed his thumbs over her neck and gripped the sides as tightly as he could. She choked and gasped, trying to pull his hands away, but it only made him more excited, more anxious, more eager to kill her. She clawed at his thick muscular forearms, her nails digging up mounds of flesh as the sensation gave Morris goosebumps down his back. This was Christmas. This was a new bicycle, the first day driving a car. This was a new home, an innocent that he was fully in charge of. He could do with her whatever he wanted. Candy's eyes rolled back as the man slammed the back of her head against the floor, knowing his night was only truly about to begin. The young nurse, with one final frantic attempt, brought her knee towards his chest, connecting it to Morris's genitals. At first, it didn't seem to faze him, but the second time he groaned and his group loosened, only slightly. The third strike was weaker. The fourth didn't make it halfway up, and Candy's leg fell limp before she could even try a fifth time. There was an explosive rush of freezing wind, and Morris screamed as his body was engulfed in the emission of a fire extinguisher. He barely had time to put a hand up before he took the instrument across the face and helplessly rolled off of Candy. He tried to defend himself, but a second slam across the side of his jaw and a third on the back of his head made him drop motionless to the floor. The mysterious savior took Candy in his arms and quickly left the maniac behind them. Willard Doolin had worked at Adder Estate for more than 10 years, and it showed. Deep canyon wrinkles, his hair was graying. Not a day went by that he didn't have a migraine or severe back pain. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours in years. His eyes like a basset hound's, only somewhat hidden behind his thick square glasses. Candy was slowly waking up when Willard looked up from behind a desk where he was diligently reading over papers. "Where are we?" Candy asked, sitting up on a couch meant for a psychologist's subject. She wasn't in her scrubs anymore, but a pair of athletic shorts and a t-shirt. "Your clothes were drenched in blood and urine. I thought it best to change you. These were my only clothes available. I believe they were another employee's. I hope you don't feel any mistrust. I am a doctor," he replied, looking down from his papers. Where are we?" Candy asked. "My office." "Why in the hell are we still inside?" she asked, standing up but keeping a hand on the couch. "Because when the lockdown initiated, it was made impossible to leave. Right now, this is the safest room besides the 6th floor, after lockdown has taken place," he casually answered. He saw Candy was confused, and he put his papers down, along with taking off his glasses. "You've never worked a shift past 5 before. At 8 o'clock at night, the building goes into lockdown, No one in, no one out till 7 a.m. Before you ask, I've tried to contact the authorities, but we have no phone service, and it seems all our cell phones have been stolen from our desks, lockers, or what have you. He replied. Candy was about to ask how when the doctor held up a hand. I don't know how. I have a few theories, each less comforting than the last. You may as well sit down. This room is blocked off by solid steel, he added, taking a flask from his drawer and offering her a drink, which Candy gladly obliged. Morris Schwartz has killed 32 people before he came to this estate. Chances are he had a cult following on the outside. The fact that our phones have been strategically stolen and the scheduling was at our weakest time of the day, it seems as though there's a man on the inside, possibly more than one. Possibly more than one man has orchestrated this break. He sighed, taking a long drink as Candy sat on the edge of his desk. Christ, I don't even know what time it is. Candy put a hand through her hair as Willard pointed at a grandfather clock. She saw it was 11 o'clock at night. My fiancé is expecting me home by 5. I mean, surely he would have called or come looking or something, she thought out loud. For his sake, and for my family's sake, I hope no one comes looking. Willard interrupted as Candy thought she heard a dull tapping. What is that? I believe there are people out there, testing the walls. They've been at it off and on for a while now. In fact, Morris was on the other side of the office where the two hid, and he was repeatedly slamming his pipe against the steel cover of the door. The only thing happening was his pipe gained a dent. Two jump-suited patients eagerly fidgeted beside him like hounds preparing to chase a rabbit. One of them clicked their tongue loudly as he scratched his own face. The second simply hopped from one foot to the other, singing a nursery rhyme. Morris growled and turned to begin beating his pipe against the singing one. He viciously slammed the pipe into the patient's skull over a dozen times, until all he was hitting was a mash. Is there really no way out of here? Candy asked, pacing the room, as Willard remained sitting at his desk. I'm sorry, but we are stuck in this office for 8 more hours. Why? Why would someone design it like that? It doesn't make any sense. What if a janitor was cleaning and got stuck in here? There has to be a way out. She growled, looking across the room with 4 other desks, several bookshelves, and an area rug. This is just aggravating enough to work, Candy thought aloud, walking towards the rug, as Willard turned in his chair to watch her pull the rug aside. As expected, she saw a trapdoor. Before you go in there, why are you taking the risk of leaving when we are perfectly safe in here? Willard asked as the young nurse opened the door and looked down the spiral stairwell that was as close-quartered as a coffin. I'm not going to stay here like his pet. The sooner I get outside, the quicker the authorities can get here. Stay here if you want, Candy spat and closed the door behind her, as Willard turned back and looked at his papers. The stairs went on for what seemed a half a mile. They were barely lit by small quarter-sized LED lights. Candy had absolutely no idea where she was headed, but she soon found herself in front of a wooden door and grabbed the handle to find at first what she thought was a locked door, but after a strong shove, she found it was just old and stuck. In the next room was a janitor-like space. There was an old mop bucket with coagulated water, several buckets of strong-smelling liquids, a shelf of towels and bed sheets. She grabbed a mop and kicked the handle in half, brandishing herself a primitive spear. The small room led to a hallway, the walls lined with open cell doors, each starting with the letter E, meaning she was on floor 5. 2 floors below the entry-level floor, which was labeled on the maps as floor C. The patient rooms were empty, and the hall was eerily silent. But she knew this place. She had worked at this hall several times. Most of the patients on this floor were too mentally held back to function the most basic of skills. Most of them were probably dead or wandering the streets. What was happening outside the asylum? Were cops forming a perimeter? Was a detective shouting orders in the rain? Was her fiancé trying to break through the police line to get in and save her? Her thoughts were broken by the sound of snickering. She looked over her shoulder, and somehow she had walked by a man who now stood behind her. He wore an overly large hooded sweatshirt and ripped jeans. His face was painted black, and he held a machete in his hand. Yes, you're the one he wants, he greeted with a low chuckle as he twirled the handle in his hand and drew the blade across his other palm, cutting open his own skin like butter. Why the fuck are you doing this? Candy ordered, holding her spear like a caveman. Morris taught us not to be afraid.
He's going to lead us to a town. Once he has you, you will be our queen of our sacrifice.
The man recited, staring blankly at her and taking a step forward.
Morris, open the light in my mind. He told me to embrace the light and communicate with the voices that you have told me to ignore.
He slowly answered, stepping forward, as Candy slowly took steps back. You have to know. This is crazy. This isn't right, Candy shouted.
You sound just like everyone else.
The man screamed, running at her with the blade overhead. The young nurse screamed and jabbed her spear forward. A stomach-churning pop of puncture vibrated down the mop handle, as the man choked up on blood on the receiving end. He dropped his weapon and fell to his knees as Candy ripped the spear free and stood in horror of her own deed. If you've never took a man's life, there's no justifiable words that could ever explain the sheer traumatizing horror. Even when they fully deserve it, even when you're defending yourself, the moment you murder, the moment you connect with a primitive, savage state of being, you step into a new life. The man held the blood-pumping wound as he tried to speak to her, but fell to his side in a crumpled heap, whispering to himself. Candy felt her arms shaking, her heart racing, but she knew her brain had shut off the rational part of her mind, her body naturally turning off what it knew it couldn't process appropriately. She had murdered a man, and she knew she'd have to again. She took only a few seconds to internally panic, and then her mind went into survival shutoff. She went into autopilot, for now she had an objective, and that objective was solely to escape. Morris paced slowly in front of the steel door, his loudly clicking companion fiddled with the materials of his own jumpsuit.
Do you know what an axe is?
Morris asked the patient, who merely blew spit bubbles.
This door is steel, but the walls are wooden. I can get through this way,
he explained to the patient, who started pulling at his own groin.
Go find an axe,
Morris shouted, shoving the man with his pipe, who clumsily ran down the hall, but stopped to run into the bathroom. Morris pressed himself against the wall, listening to the termites inside, the mice crawling through the tunnels. He told himself till he convinced himself that he could hear Candy breathing on the other side of the wall.
Are you there?
He asked, rubbing his mangled hand over the wall. The glass bits ripped through the wallpaper. He imagined her. He imagined that she was pressing against the wall, trying to force her body through to meet his. As suddenly Morris fell to his knees. He found he was sobbing deeply. He cried so hard he had to drop his pipe and hold his head. His body convulsed as his cries turned into wails. He slammed a fist against the wall, trying to control himself. He slammed a second time as his throat choked on tears. Blood dripped off his glass-riddled hand as he gripped his fist tighter and began smacking the back of his own head, again and again. The pain was blinding, but he couldn't stop himself. After the 9th smack, he stopped, and he slowly stood up, wiping the tears and snot from the nose and mouth.
I'll find you, he promised. I will go to the ends of this earth, and I will go to the deepest oceans, to the highest mountains. There is nothing I won't do to get to you.
He swore loudly as his axe-finding companion returned with not an axe, but a toothbrush, which Morris took, threw over his shoulder, and walked away from the patient to find the axe himself. Candy walked up the flight of stairs, passing floor D and towards C, which was the ground floor. Though Willard had said it was impossible to get out, he didn't know about the trapdoor, so it was possible there was still a way. Or did he? Candy asked. She paused and thought about the implications. She shook her head and continued. She knew she had to keep going. As Candy reached floor C, she could hear loud laughter and commotion. Most of it sounded like unintelligible conversation that would then be broken up by noises of babbling and nonsense. She peered through the glass window of the door and saw a group of hooded men nailing a dead body to the wall of the hallway, as they talked about guns and hunting experiences. A fourth man drug another corpse up and held it up as they began nailing it to the next one. They seemed to be only armed with the hammer and the machete that was lying against their backs. She heard more conversation, though, and had no way of telling how many were out of her sight. She ducked away from the window and mapped out her next plan. She'll go to floor D, go through the hall, and up the opposite stairwell. Maybe there won't be guys at that end. She quickly moved from door to door and back down the stairs, noting another camera was watching her. What caught her eye was the power light was still on, and the camera shifted to follow her pacing. D Hall was very similar to E Hall, but the clients were considered to be mostly vegetables, though some would be able to walk around, but that was about the extent of their maximum abilities. Candy quickly made her way there, forcing herself to look away from the mutilated remains of people in their beds. Organs were spilled across the hall, ligaments, eyeballs, pounds of skin were nailed in random areas. The smell was indescribable. She could barely breathe as she trudged through the horror. She passed a client who was gorging themselves on the remains of a person, but instead of attacking her, they screamed and slammed the patient room's door shut, and then opened it, and then slammed it shut again. A few patients were alive and awake, but in a coma-like state, still strapped to their beds. Their eyes followed her helplessly as she passed, and it made her feel sick. Candy reached the end of the hall and began her way up the steps. It was soaked in bloody prints, but it was quieter than the other side she had come from. At the top of the stairwell, she peered out the window but saw no one. Pushing the door open, she made her way out into the entry-level hall. Large windows too high to reach and covered in bars revealed that the storm was still raging outside. She took a moment to look out the window and looked for anything to give her a boost, but the designers of the asylum had that exact thought in mind and kept it barren, making it impossible for her or any patients to be able to get to the windows. She could faintly hear the commotion from before, but the floor was curved, so it kept visibility apart. She couldn't see the man mutilating the bodies at the other end, but thankfully they couldn't see her. She mapped out the floor in her mind and realized the front door was towards the men she had avoided previously. There was a side door, though. She never used it, but the other staff did for smoke breaks. It was closer to her side. In fact, it should only be a few yards away. She didn't allow herself to get excited, but her heart picked up with anticipation. Willard looked up from his desk as he heard the thumping grow louder and louder towards the front door. He took a drink from his flask as the walls shook in front of him. He could hear Morris screaming louder and louder. The man stood from his desk and inched towards the trapdoor under the rug. It was then the axe head split the wall's wood, and Willard fell to a knee and grabbed at the trapdoor. He desperately pulled it open as the axe tore from the wall and slammed against it. Pieces of wood began tearing away as Morris and the patient companion ripped away whatever they could. Willard had just descended into the stairs when Morris peered inside. "It's empty," he growled and began hacking the patient next to him into bloody chops. It was suddenly then the trapdoor slammed back shut, getting the maniac's attention. The patient next to him was still alive, but lied silently in pain. "What's this now?" he asked. "Get in there. Check out that door for me," he ordered, began hacking at the wall to make it bigger. Morris got one foot in the wall when a hooded man ran towards him, being sure to avoid the half-dead man on the floor. "Morris, the nurse is on floor C," he shouted as the maniac turned to face him. He stepped out of the wall, twirling his axe in his hand as the hooded man bowed his head. The maniac handed him the axe and, without a word, walked away. The hooded man finished killing the patient on the floor. Candy stopped inside the door frame of one room away from the side door that she planned to go to. Two hooded men were dragging a body only a few feet away from that door. Their victim was still alive, but barely. The victim groaned as most of his blood has left his femoral artery. Candy was beside herself. If she attempted to save him, she'd have to fight two of the thugs. If she didn't, she could escape out the side door, but then she would leave someone to die. With the amount of blood she saw, though, he was going to die soon. She winced when she heard him screaming as the two thugs began beating him with whatever they had turned into clubs. One of the hooded men brandished a baseball bat and was mid-swing when Candy speared the middle of his armpit, killing him almost instantly. The second brought his plank of wood across the nurse's face, sending her to the floor. She held her mop handle up as the man swung at her again and again. She blocked most of the hits but the ones that got through nearly knocked her unconscious. She was struck once more in the face and fell to the ground as the crazed man immediately descended upon her. She brought her mop handle up quickly to the side, cracking it to the man's knee, and followed through with a kick to his genitals, making him double over and then land chin first on her mop handle. She laid there with the body pinned above her till she was able to push it aside, and then she rolled over to the person she had tried to save. Within a minute, however, she knew he was dead, and she knew two of her ribs were cracked from the board beating. She coughed a few times as blood and bits of teeth fell from her own mouth. She ripped She ripped the spear free and looked up to see Morris standing at the front end of the hall. "What do you want from me?" she screamed, gripping her spear tightly, and prepared for him to charge. "Why are you doing this? I deserve an answer," she shouted. But the killer didn't charge. He walked with confidence that he had her trapped. "Why?" she asked back as the power flickered. Why me? This is crazy."
"Why?"
he asked back as the power flickered once more.
"This is not for me,"
he explained as Candy kept her sight directly on him, and him alone.
This is all for you,"
he whispered, now only 15 feet from her. "Stay the fuck back," Candy shouted, stepping back.
"It's always been about you. Every person I've ever killed has been leading up to this pristine moment. From the moment I was born, it's always been about you,"
Morris assured, twirling his pipe to get a firmer grip. The lightning outside flashed brilliantly, filling the room with the intense light as thunder crackled like a strike in a bowling alley. "I swear to God I'll kill you. You won't be the first. You think I won't do it? Look at those bodies. I did that," she screamed. But Morris was unimpressed, and within a heartbeat he smacked the spear aside and grabbed her throat with one hand and slammed her against the wall.
"I am God in here,"
he growled with his pipe lying by his feet. He gripped her throat and ran his mangled hand across her face, cutting several lacerations across her, as she cried out and tried to punch at him, but her blows had no effect.
"Accept me as your lord. It is only I who can set you free,"
he promised loudly in her ear as he firmly shoved his knee against her groin.
"Tonight,"
he whispered, biting her ear till it began to bleed,
"I will cut open your stomach, and I will truly know you as no one ever has before."
He swore as Candy tried to scream and lifted her feet to meet his chest in an attempt to push him away. There was an explosion of sound as suddenly Morris's eyes widened and his grip released. Candy fell to the floor, choking as Morris fell to his knees. Blood dripped from his mouth when Candy saw a gaping hole in the side of his head. Gunfire overwhelmed the air as she fell to the floor with her hands over her head. Uniformed man after man ran by her, their boots thundering as they shouted and fired their weapons. The screams of completely surprised thugs were only a brief precursor to the hail of bullets, as Candy heard the soft, raspy breath of Morris dying next to her. He blinked once, and with the faintest of sounds, whispered,
"Nothing will ever stop me. Not even death."
Time passed. Candy stood in the rain with a blanket wrapped around her shoulder. Her fiancé held her, but she couldn't feel him. He spoke to her, but his voice was a tunnel. The flashing lights of cop cars and ambulances were like distant stars. Candy blinked and fell to the ground in deepest agony, her screams only matched by the thunder.